So, today I'll be talking about this phenomenon that many biracial and multiracial people tend to experience, and it's called racial imposter syndrome. So, one time I heard this biracial person put into words something that I never quite been able to express myself. She said, "Living at the intersection of different identities is like stumbling in the forest in the dark." Growing up, I was constantly asked the question, "Where are you from?" And to this, I would reply that I'm from a small town on the outskirts of Sacramento. After replying to this way, many people would still look really confused and they weren't completely satisfied with my answer, so they would continue asking, "No, I mean, like, where are your people from? Like, what are you?" And they would say that I didn't look completely Hispanic and I didn't look completely white, so they were kind of confused about what I was. And to this, I would hesitantly reply that I'm half Nicaraguan, half white. But I was hesitant to claim both identities because I just never felt like I could. I didn't feel comfortable doing so. This was partly because I grew up in a very Hispanic household. And although my dad was white, he spoke Spanish and he lived in Mexico for 2 years and he was a Spanish teacher, so he really embraced the Hispanic culture. And then on top of this, I grew up in a neighborhood dominated by ethnic minorities. And so I was also mainly cared for by my step-grandmother, who's Mexican and doesn't really speak any English. However, growing up, I was very singled out by my family for being the white one in the family. My cousin would always make these comments. He would always say that I couldn't say something or do something because I was white. And this was very gut-wrenching to me, a little kid. And because of that, I started feeling ashamed to claim that I was Hispanic. However, I didn't completely feel like I could fit in with white people because I didn't grow up in that culture. And they would always look at me like their foreign friend too. They would constantly ask me if I knew things about Mexico or if I knew things about certain types of Hispanic traditions. And some of them I did know and some of them I didn't because, all these Hispanic cultures are different. People would sometimes just assume that I'm Mexican. And then they would always ask me if I could speak Spanish to them, not really considering that maybe I'm not the most comfortable with Spanish. But if I said that I didn't feel comfortable with Spanish, I also felt like, okay, maybe I'm not Hispanic. But their questions for the most part didn't really anger me because I realized that many people just weren't aware that what they were saying was offensive. And this was my experience with racial imposter syndrome. Now, you're probably wondering, what is racial imposter syndrome? And it's a new name for a phenomenon that many biracial and multiracial people experience. It's a feeling of confusion in regards to racial identity that's experienced slightly different in every individual. For example, for me, I felt ashamed to claim or identify with the white culture or Hispanic culture because I didn't feel like I had enough claim to either identity. I didn't feel Hispanic enough. I didn't feel white enough. And so that was my experience with it, but some people experience it a little bit differently. And now, why is it important that we talk about it? Why is it important to you? And it's important, I think, to everyone because it's such a growing issue in today's society. It's not just an issue in our community, but it's an issue nationally. It's an issue in the world with the growing number of multiracial and biracial people. According to the 2010 National Census, about more than 50%, there was an increase about 50% in the number of people who identified as biracial or multiracial. And with the 2020 census coming out in a couple of months here, we can expect those numbers to skyrocket even more. And even though these numbers are growing continuously and so much, it's still something that's barely researched, something that's barely even talked about. Like, even people who experience it don't quite understand it, don't even know that there's a name for it. Like, I didn't know that there's a name for this feeling until a couple months ago when I started looking into it more. I always felt like I was kind of alone in this, and then I started realizing that so many other people experience this as well. Now, in order to better understand racial imposter syndrome, we have to talk about imposter syndrome or imposter phenomenon, which is a widely recognized psychological phenomenon that racial imposter syndrome stems from. So, imposter phenomenon is something that occurs in high achieving individuals where they basically they attribute their success and their abilities to luck rather than their ability to do something. And they fear that people unmask them as frauds who have just been getting by on luck. And so, with this phenomenon, there has been a high correlation with the family, a need to please others in the family. And we saw that in recent studies, we found that individuals, like children who lack parental support, they're at higher risk of basically developing this false self, this false identity, in order to try to obtain validation from their family, from their parents. In addition to the family dynamic, there's a lot of society pressures that add to this problem. According to an article in the American Psychological Association, Kristen Ryan said, "In our society, there's a huge pressure to achieve. There can be a lot of confusion between approval and love and worthiness. Self-worth becomes contingent on achieving." With both of these phenomenons, it's not as much of an internalized issue as it is an externalized issue. Now, understanding imposter syndrome is a stepping stone in helping people to better understand racial imposter syndrome. The difference between the two is that people who experience racial imposter syndrome feel like frauds in their identity and not in their ability to succeed. However, just like imposter syndrome, society plays a huge role in our struggle with racial identity. Many of us feel like frauds trying to claim both identities, and we feel this pressure from society to choose one race or the other to identify with, but never both. A lot of times people treat us like we're one side of the spectrum. In an NPR podcast that I was listening to recently, I heard this other biracial person share her experience with racial imposter syndrome. And this is what she said. "White people like to believe I'm Caucasian like them. I think it makes their life a little less complicated, but I don't identify as 100% white. So there comes a time in the conversation and relationship where I need to out myself and tell them that I'm biracial. It's a vulnerable experience, but it becomes even harder when I'm with Black Americans. It may sound strange, and there are so many layers to this that are hard to unpack, but I think what it comes down to is they have more claim to Blackness than I ever will, and therefore have the power to tell me that I don't belong, I'm not enough, that I should stay on the white side of the identity line. You know that question we always get asked? What are we? Well, I still don't know. I never had an answer that I can say with confidence. I still don't know what I'm allowed to claim." Now, like this person, many of us are continuously asking this question: what do I have a right to this label? Because of this feeling that we don't have enough claim, that we don't look the part, we feel this pressure to start acting like the stereotype. Now, remember how I said that each and every individual experiences it differently? So, some of us might look like one race, but not like the other race that we identify with, leading people to assume that we're strictly just one race. However, looking like we belong doesn't always mean that we feel like we belong. Some people grow up in a family dominated by one culture and know little about the other. For example, Summer Durant, a Georgetown alumni who is half black and half Indian, grew up in a predominantly black neighborhood and saw little of her Indian side. However, she looked Indian. But, so like people just always assumed she was just Indian. But she said, claiming a culture that you know little about feels a whole lot like lying. So, racial imposter syndrome can be experienced differently by people. But each and every one of us are constantly fighting. We're constantly trapped between two halves, trying to prove ourselves to both communities. Now, to fix this issue, there's no one size fits all answer. It basically defies our intersexual identities, but we can try to better understand our racial differences. As African American businesswoman Melody Hudson once said, we need to stop becoming colorblind and start becoming color brave. We need to start having those uncomfortable conversations about race. We need to start becoming comfortable with having those uncomfortable conversations. And in doing so, we can become more educated. We can start better understanding one another and better understanding the effects of our words. There is no answer. It's only an understanding. An understanding that we will never completely understand, but a willingness to try. You will never know my experience, and I will never truly know someone else's. We can only listen to one another and empathize, knowing that it is more about listening and being listened to. Thank you.